All right, gang, welcome to the weekly Mac Forum video chat. It's Sunday, May 8th, 2016, Mother's Day here in the States. Want to wish all of our members, the ladies in our audience, happy Mother's Day. Hope you enjoyed the day. As usual, we've got a pretty good roundup of stuff for you this evening. It may not be as much of a gas and go show as it was last week. We're audio only this week, having some lighting issues in the broadcast bunker here. So we'll move on with just the audio. Uh, all right, let's get right into everything here. First of all, want to welcome our newest member, Winslow 1132. Um, as usual, we've had quite a few members join this week, and that was the latest. And also, happy birthday to member Bungtray 2016. Hope I pronounced that correctly. I'll try to remember to sneak in a few member birthdays each week from now on. Just something else to be interesting. And we got a lot of useful information here for you this week. As usual, we have the forum roundup. And I want to remind you that if you have a question and you need to get an answer to your question, what you need to do is to become a member. It doesn't cost you anything, and you can search the forum for free, but posting a question requires becoming a member. I know a lot of times people will post their question in the contact us area. That's not a good place for it. That little area is only really seen by the forum moderators and administration team. So go ahead and become a member and join in all the fun. And just a sample of some of the stuff that we have this week. First of all, uh, let's get started with Mac Forum member Randy Singer. Some of you may know Randy from some of his books on Mac related issues. I had several of them at one point and made me look like a genius numerous times as I was taking care of a Mac issue for one person or another. Thanks, Randy, for that. Uh, Randy has a couple threads going this week that I think you'll find really helpful. The first one, he talks about a little bit about data detectors. Now, these, for the most part, work back and forth between Apple apps, but I think there's a few other third party applications that might make use of this. Um, the data detectors have been around the Mac ecosystem for quite some time. I didn't take time this week to try to pin down exactly when they emerged, but what they do, this is my vote for one of the best little used features of the OS and of Apple applications. What they do is they look for certain types of formatting. A data detector, if an app can handle data detectors, what it does is it looks at the formatting of the data that you put in and then tries to pass that information to an application that can handle that type of data appropriately. For example, if you are working in notes and or in mail, for example, and you receive an email with a date formatted in the standard date format, when you that date will often appear blue as highlighted. When you click on it, that date then gets passed on to the calendar app. Calendar will open, and you can then enter that information into your calendar. In fact, most of the time it will already pop up with some of the information already filled in. You can do this with notes. Data detection is part of the reason that um, I think notes now makes use of data detection to some extent because when I'm doing the show notes, and I embed the link in the notes. I don't have to tell uh, Notes to open this in my web browser. It knows. Data detection is something, as I say, it's been around for a while, comes in handy. And thanks to Randy's reminder, I'm going to start looking for more ways to put it to good use. Also, Randy's been a busy little worker bee this week. Some of you, if you're familiar with Randy's work, you may know that he heads up a rather large Macintosh user group. And because of the nature of their work and within legal issues, many of them make use of Microsoft Word quite extensively. And as because of that, Randy has over the years picked up a number of Microsoft Word tips that he finds very useful. And he started a thread on the forum this week with some of those tips, some of the things that he's found very useful. And he's planning to update that thread periodically. He's already got several tips up there. Just to give you a summary, for example, if you copy text from a document and paste it into Word, it generally takes on, uh, it retains the formatting that it had. Okay, that it had originally. So if you paste a bit of text from, say, a web page, and you just paste it directly into Microsoft Word using a standard cut and paste, then it's going to retain usually the formatting for whatever web page that you took it from. Uh, Now, what you can do to avoid that is, instead of just doing a paste, go to the edit menu, choose Paste Special, and then choose Unformatted Text, and then click OK. Okay. There isn't a keyboard shortcut for this in most versions of Word, but you can assign it a keyboard shortcut. And Randy in the thread gives you the description of how to assign that keyboard shortcut. There are some other tips that he already has up. One of them would be really helpful if you are working on rather long documents, and that is the ability to allow you to quickly uh, jump back and forth between sections of a document. And in one of the posts in the thread, excuse me, Randy goes into some detail about how to do that. It's not incredibly complicated. It's one that I did not know. That's one of the word tips that I did not know. It's not a feature that I have to use often, but it's kind of nice to know that that's there. Also, in that thread thus far are links to several websites that have additional Microsoft Word tips. And as I say, Randy is planning to periodically update that. So you might want to bookmark that thread and check it regularly to make sure that you have the most recent tips. And I'll have a link to that in the show notes for this week. And just to give you an idea of some of the other things that have come up this week, we have a Mac Forum blog post. Those of you that follow the forum blog, about using Dropbox to manage situations where you're running out of hard drive space on your Mac. As most of you know, if you've bought a newer Mac recently, particularly in the notebooks, in the Mac Pros, uh, with the move to the flash storage, those drives can get very small very quickly. You'll outgrow those drives very quickly, and it can be difficult to add additional internal storage. Depending upon which model you have, there may or may not be um, a method for you to add additional internal storage. And even if there is, the process in terms of installation is not always for the faint of heart. So, in the blog post, the writer talks about using Dropbox uh, and particularly the selective sync feature to keep a series of documents on your um, Mac, but also keep um, some of that in Dropbox. Now, the reason I say selective syncing is the key to this whole issue is this. Let's say that you've got a large number of photos or anything like that on your Dropbox in Dropbox. You obviously don't want that large folder mirrored back to your Mac. It defeats the whole purpose of using Dropbox as a means of um, managing your storage space. But what you could do is set up some files that are selectively synced. So maybe it's just the one or two files or handful of files that you need right now for this particular project, as opposed to, say, projects that you did 6 months ago, 2 weeks ago, a month ago, whenever. So take a look at that. It explains the situation pretty well. Um, and that that gives you some idea of what the kinds of tips and tricks that you'll see in the forum. Now we're going to branch out a little bit, and I'll talk about a couple of tips and tricks that I ran into in other locations and reading other sites. One of them, I believe, comes from Rob Lefevre over at Cult of Mac, and his tip centers around using Google Maps uh, when you are in an area where you don't have a network connection. Okay, on your smartphone or your tablet when you don't have a network connection. Um, this takes a little bit of advanced preparation on your part, but it's not difficult to do. What it's going to require you to do, let's say that you know where you're going. All right. You're going to, let's say you're going to a nearby city. You want a map of certain locations. So, what you're going to do is you're going to open Google Map while you still have a good network connection. In other words, before you leave home or before you lose your network connection. And then in the search field, you're going to type, quote, OK maps, unquote. Leave the quotes off, just type OK maps. All right. And then you will be asked if you want to download that area, map for that area. Okay. You'll certainly want to pick OK, and you will be asked to name that area. Uh, then you'll be able to go back. It's going to store the the information that you've downloaded on your map, on your iOS device, on your smartphone, on your tablet. I believe he mentions that this also works with the Android version of Google Maps. And then you can pull this up later when you need it and don't have a working video connection. I used to do something similar. Before we switched carriers, sometimes when we would drive out of town in our area, we did not have a good enough network connection to make use of turn by turn navigation on our older iPhones. And when we shifted carriers and got new phones, we were driving out of town one day, and I had pulled up the directions in my phone and forgotten that I had them open on my phone. I had my phone in my pocket, forgot that I had that on. And all of a sudden the phone starts talking to me, turn right in 2 miles or or whatever it was. Took me a minute to realize what was going on. I actually had a good enough connection for the navigation to work. Well, one of the things that I used to do to avoid the hassle of not having a good enough connection to do turn by turn navigation is I would go into either I'd on while I was on my Mac sitting at home, I'd go into the Google Maps into the map program, find the enter the information for the location that I wanted the map for, pull that up, save it as a PDF, and you can do that in Safari with the export to PDF command in the file menu. And then I would uh, sync my phone and put that PDF onto my phone. It didn't have, obviously, you lost the voice feature in terms of telling you to turn anyway. But since I was in the shotgun seat, not doing the driving, I could read the directions and say, okay, in 5 miles we got to turn right or left or whatever, you know, and that worked as an alternative. But this seems to be a little cleaner method to do that. I have a full details in the show link there. Um, Another little tip that I believe also comes from Rob Lefevre has to do with making your phone seem faster. If you're running iOS 9 on an older device and it seems like it's starting to slow down a little bit, turning off the animation features, although it turns off some cool looking features, turning those off may speed up your phone a little bit, certainly make it appear to be running a little bit faster. Okay, what you can do to do that, it's actually very simple, and it involves going into the settings, into the accessibility features, and then going to the one that says reduce motion and switch that from on to off. It's going to turn off a lot of the parallax animations and things of that nature. And although those look cool to some people don't like them, and some people find that on older devices it kind of slows things down. So that's a good way to speed things up just a little bit. All right. One a couple of other things I want to mention real quickly here while we're in the tips and tricks thing. We went through Randy's tips. Uh, there are some things that have come out this week about Apple Music, and this is I'm going to use this to lead into another tip. Um, there's a gentleman by the name of uh, Pinkstone, James Pinkstone, who wrote in his blog about Apple Music basically deleting over 120 gigabyte of music from his hard drive. Now, I first saw this in Kirk the iTunes guy's column, and Kirk is not convinced that Apple Music is the culprit here. Uh, in fact, he emailed Mr. Pinkstone, but at this point, Mr. Pinkstone is no longer using Apple Music, and so they weren't able to run down exactly what the cause was. Uh, Kirk feels like if this issue with deleting music were actually an issue, you would see there would be, and these are my words, not his, a riot on the internet. Uh, and as some of you know, there were people who reported earlier about problems with iTunes Music Match basically messing up their library and things like that. So the reason I put that tip right here in the how to section is it led me to put a note in the show notes to remind you about something. Whether Okay, let's assume for a moment that you don't believe Mr. Pinkstone, that you don't believe that Apple Music is deleting music from your hard drive. Okay, that's all well and good, but that still means that you should have a backup of your music. And when I say music, I mean media and or any other files that you consider important, be they work files, personal photos, whatever they are. But in this specific case, we're talking about media. Now, I've mentioned to you before that Apple will allow you to re-download purchased music. And I think this applies to other things that you've actually purchased in the iTunes store. But I would not, emphasis on the word not here, see my arms. If the camera were on, you might see my arms flailing wildly into the air as I scream, "Danger, Will Robinson." Do not count on that as your means of backing up your iTunes stuff. And let me tell you why. Some of you who are longtime forum members will know this. Uh, Last year, maybe 2 years ago, the little NAS device that I had my iTunes library on had a complete and total meltdown. Um, Multiple gigabytes worth of media were on that drive, and I went to start kind of recreating the drive, the media, just adding back stuff, and I didn't want to go back and re-rip my content. And in addition to that, I also had a number of files that I had downloaded from the Apple Store. In other words, from the iTunes Store. In other words, I did not have physical media to go back and re-rip that from. Well, I was in the process of reloading from a backup, reloading my iTunes library from a backup that I'd made, but that was on CDs, a series of DVDs. And I got to doing that. And as I was about to start, one of my friends reminded me that Apple would allow you to download uh, to re-download content. And so I started doing that, thinking that would be much easier than digging out the old DVDs, waiting for them to spin up, read them off the DVD, copying into iTunes, lather, rinse, repeat for about 30 um, Blu-ray discs, 25 or 30 discs worth of information. Well, as I started to download some of the material that I'd purchased from iTunes, I noticed something. On one or two of the albums, only a handful of tracks were available out of probably 30 tracks that should have been on that album. Now, I assume that what had happened was that there had been some licensing change and that Apple was no longer allowed to have that content in the iTunes store. Well, consequently, you couldn't download it from the iTunes store because it wasn't there anymore. Fortunately, that was one of the things that was on the backups that I had. So even though Apple has that backup feature that lets you re-download material that you've purchased, don't count on that as your primary means of backup. It because it really, I mean, first of all, you're going to use some bandwidth doing this. So if you're on a metered connection or you've got a bad internet connection, you're kind of out somewhere where you don't have a really good internet connection, it's going to be time consuming to do. So just be aware of that and account for that in your backup strategy. All right, we went through the tips on using Google Maps. Um, and the last iOS tip for the night has to do with moving your backups, your iOS device backups from iTunes into an external drive. Normally, those are stored within a certain location on your internal hard drive. And as you know, if you're on a drive that is low on space or one of these drives that's difficult to upgrade, that can be an issue. Sometimes you want to clean off as much stuff as you can. There is a procedure to move that move those backups to an external drive and then load them as needed. I won't try to talk you through this process this evening. It involves some terminal commands, which are difficult to just talk about. You really need to see them. And besides, as you guys know, I am allergic to terminal. Okay. It gives me the hives. All right. It is not fair to make me discuss terminal. Okay. You guys thought I was a Mac genius, and then somebody made me try to discuss terminal. Come on. um, terminal gives me the hives because it's one of the areas that proves that I might not be the Mac genius that I thought I was. But anyway, I'll have a link to that in the show notes. Um, and along the lines with Mac news, let's go to a couple of other things. This one's kind of a news, kind of a hint kind of thing. Didn't quite know where to put it, so this seems like a good place. Um, as I mentioned to you a couple weeks ago, Kirk, the iTunes guy, now in his Macworld columns and on his site, periodically runs things that he calls, Hey, Apple, fix this. Okay. And this week's Hey, Apple, fix this is a problem with, let's say you're using the Reminder app to create a list of things to do, and you need to share that app, that reminder, with other people on your team. You know, you're collaborating on a project. You need to share that information with other people so that they can know what's next on the to do list, what has been done, what's coming up, that kind of thing. Well, it's relatively easy to share that with iOS users. So if you've got a Mac user or an iPhone, iPad user, you can share that with them. But it does not work, or at least Kirk can't figure out a way to do it with uh, non-iOS devices. In other words, if your team member is using a Windows phone, is using Android, it's not going to work. You can't share it, and this is something that Kirk thinks to could be fixed and needs to be fixed. And I kind of agree with him. I understand Apple wanting to keep things within the Apple ecosystem, but sometimes we got to admit that there are a lot of people out there who are not using iOS devices. Now, I may need to pass something like that to them as seamlessly as possible. So that he has some thoughts about that. You can take a look at that in the article. And also along the lines of Apple News, let's move on into a little bit of that. TechCrunch is reporting, I mentioned Apple Music earlier because of the issues with whether or not it was eating people's data. TechCrunch is reporting that there's going to be a revamp of the Apple Music ecosystem. Uh, Reports suggesting the are suggesting at this point that this will be announced at Worldwide Developer Conference in June, and that a couple of the things that will be announced are um, one, a reduction in price for students, uh, so that you could, when you become a student, you could, instead of paying the $10 a month fee, it would go to $5 a month. And that could theoretically run the entire time that you are a student. So that's one of the things. Another thing that has come up is uh, that I believe it was 9 to 5 Mac that first reported that there would be some changes to the Apple Music itself, particularly to the the social aspect of it that allowed you to connect with the feature that allowed you to connect with artists, to share pictures, them to share pictures with their fans, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. It seems like perhaps that has not taken off as much as Apple had hoped. And as a result, there's some indication that, or some expectation that that feature will basically get pinged. And and those of you that have been around a while remember that ping was an initial start at trying to find other users who shared a similar uh, musical taste, and it just never quite got off the ground. So there's some indication that those announcements will come during a worldwide developer conference. And as I say, we've already seen the report that that feature, that social feature of Apple Music, will kind of go by the boards when iOS 10 is released later this year. We'll have to take a wait and see on that, but I can tell you just from my uh, roamings on the internet, a lot of people do find the interface for Apple Music confusing. And so anything they can do in the way of a revamp of that interface uh, would be a good thing. You are also starting to see people to say both about iTunes and the music app on the iOS devices that maybe we're trying to do too much in one app. I don't know what the solution is. I've said for a while that maybe iTunes needs to be rethought in such a way that it contained separate little modules, each module designed to do certain things. One, for example, would handle music and downloading and playback of music, and one would handle um, video, and and then another for internet radio. Little modules that do internet radio, and then what you would see when you launch the program is one unifying uh, set of icons, a basically a which one do you want to do. And if you picked movies, then it would go, if you were interested in video at that particular time, it would go to whatever little mini app was designed to do video. If you wanted music, it would do that, go to that section. If you wanted internet radio, then it would go to the little module that's designed to do that. And each module would have a button to kick you back to the main screen. Um, I think something similar to that could work and maybe cut down on the launch time, because to be honest with you, if you don't have a fairly fast machine these days, iTunes still can bog down on your system. That's been true for the last several versions, and this is coming from somebody that likes iTunes. As a concept, I like it. I use it quite regularly, but we're reaching the point where it's becoming a little cumbersome for a lot of users. Uh, some of the little quirks and etc. are getting a little bit cumbersome, and I think it's time we take a look at that. So that's going to just about do it for this week, folks. Um, I have, and I see my camera looks like it has kicked back on, which I didn't know. Uh, so that video may be a little dark there. I thought that was off, but apparently it did not take. But I apologize for that one. But that's going to just about do it for the tips and tricks and all the little info this week. Took us just a little over a half an hour, but that's okay. I hope that you enjoyed the information that we brought to you this week. I'll be happy to continue these and bring you more next week. In the meantime, look for me in the forum. You can find me as Sly Dude. And if you have comments about the show or a suggestion for something you'd like to see me discuss, put it in there is a Sunday chat thread in the community announcements area of the forum. That's a good place to put it. Or if you want to send me a PM about something, that's also a good way to go. So until next week, this is Sylvester Rock, aka Sly Dude. I will see you in the forum.